This week we're looking at Rousseau, right? And Rousseau's solution to how we get out of the state of nature, right? And going even farther, not just how do we get out of the state of nature, but how do we get in? How do we get out of this mess that we've gotten into as we've come out of the state of nature, right? Because if you remember in Rousseau's account in the Discourses, he was talking about how the state of nature was good, right? Man is born free. Man is generally pretty amiable with other people, right? He has empathy towards other people. He has, of course, self-preservation. But it's not until little communities and societies form that this sort of ego arises, right? The amour propre, right, where you're loving yourself, not self-preservation, but loving your reputation, loving your status, and that's led us to this nasty materialistic place, like we saw, for instance, portrayed by the humans in Avatar, right, versus the Na'vi in Avatar, and how they had more of a sort of noble savage thing, right? So this week we're looking at an excerpt from Rousseau's The Social Contract, or of The Social Contract. And this is Rousseau's answer to how do we get out? How can we get out of this mess that we've gotten into? How do we retain what was good about the state of nature and still enjoy the benefits of coming together as a collective body, right? And that's the riddle that Rousseau tries to solve in the Social Contract. I've posted some lecture notes on Canvas, so if you guys want to follow along with the slideshow, whatever, I'm just going to flip through the slideshow real quickly here as I talk about this, right? So it's Rousseau's solution to the problem that we've gotten ourselves into through agriculture and metallurgy and coming together and being in love with ourselves. Here are a couple of quotes. One is from The Social Contract. Each of us puts his person and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will, right? So this general will, although Rousseau seems to think that that's the solution, it can be seen as nefarious in some ways, as we'll talk about. And in our corporate capacity, we receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole, right? And that's taken from Rousseau's Social Contract. And the film that I've asked you guys to watch this week is Star Trek First Contact, right? And the reason I chose that is because there is an entity in the Star Trek called the Borg, right? Which is this collective entity that the general will, everything that benefits the Borg themselves is considered supreme, not the individuality of the members of the Borg, but it's the collective. And it's just sort of, it's reminiscent in some ways of what Rousseau is talking about with his notion of the general will, which we'll talk about, right? So here's a famous quote from the Borg. We are the Borg. Lower your shields and surrender your ships. We will add your biological and technological distinctiveness to our own. Your culture will adapt to service us. Resistance is futile, right? Okay, so the Social Contract, as I said, Rousseau wrote this 8 years after the Discourse on the Origins of Inequality was published, and he's picking up where he left off. Remember, sort of the problem, and this is how he actually starts the Social Contract, is with his most famous quote, where he says, "Man is born free, but everywhere is a chain." So what he means by that statement, where he says man is born free, but everywhere is in chains, is going back to this notion of the noble savage, right? We saw that man in the state of nature was perfectly free and happy, right? But now, after all this process of coming together and forming societies and agriculture, etc., now everywhere he's in chains, right? His freedom has been infringed upon by, and of course, if you carry out Rousseau's story about agriculture and metallurgy, and ended up exactly where Europe was in the 18th and 19th centuries, right, where you had the monarchs and the corruption and stuff like that, and how people were slaves and indentured servants. So that's what he means when he says that we were born free, but now, right, as he was writing it, everybody seems to be indebted or in chains to, with the exception of perhaps the royalty or the nobility, right? So in this work, the social contract, he's trying to figure out, okay, how can we solve this problem? How can we take what was good about the state of nature, our freedom, right? And how can we take what is actually good about being part of a political community, mutual protection for one another and things like that? How can we reconcile these two, right? So I say here that the account in the social contract is not naturalistic, right? Whereas the account in the discourse is supposed to be naturalistic. Rousseau actually thinks this is an account of how human civilization has evolved, right? We actually came out of the state of nature and ended up, in modern society. But the account of the social contract he gives in the social contract is normative, right? And normative just means it's concerned with the way something should be, right? This is what we should do if we want to get at. It's not necessarily the way things are, but it's the way that things should be, right? And that's what Rousseau thinks about his account of the social contract. All right, so I say here he just seeks to answer the fundamental question of politics as he sees it. How do you reconcile the freedom of the individual with the authority of the state? Right? And of course, this is something that we see very clearly in our own Constitution. Right? If you look at the original draft of the Constitution of the United States, there was no Bill of Rights. Right? It was just purely concerned with the procedures of the federal government and the authority of the federal government. Right? But then there were these other folks who came along and said, well, wait a minute, how? Okay, so yeah, so he's setting out to try to figure out some sort of way out of the mess that we've gotten ourselves into by leaving the state of nature, right? And Rousseau says it's if we follow this account, it'll be a place where people will enjoy both the protection of the common force, the state, while remaining as free as they were in the state of nature, which seems impossible, right? You think about going back to Hobbes. He said that the individual freedom is not the thing that matters. It's submitting your freedom to the sovereign, right? So you're giving up some of your freedom. So this notion of keeping the same amount of freedom as you give up would have been absurd to Hobbes, but that's what Rousseau is after in this. He's trying to figure out, how do we do that? And the way that he comes up with doing it is something he calls the general will, right? And he says that the general will is the collective will of the citizen body taken as a whole, right? So maybe think about like a democracy, right? We come up with the general, we vote, if it's a direct democracy, we vote, and whoever, whatever gets the most votes is considered to be the general will, right? And Rousseau says that the general will is the source of law, right? So it's the source of legitimacy, and it is willed by each and every citizen. Now remember, this is normative. This is the way that it should be, right? Because I know you're thinking, well, it's surely not the case that everybody's going to agree on everything. Well, Rousseau believed that in the ideal society, right, in the ideal political community, everybody, every individual, through certain moral development or whatever, would agree with what the general will is, because they would recognize that's what is good for the general will is in fact what is good for them. And he says here, in obeying the law, each citizen is thus subject to his or her own will, because the individual will and the general will should be the same, right? And therefore, according to Rousseau, everybody remains free. Well, it sounds a little ridiculous, right? But this is what he thinks needs to happen in order for us to get back on the right track, right? And then I have here what we owe one another, right? So there are reciprocal duties in this new society that we've created, right? So the sovereign, in this case, the sovereign is the general will, right? The people coming together to form sort of a new body, right? Is committed to the good of the individuals that constitute it, right? So the general will should be taking into account what is good for the individual will, and likewise, the individual should be committed to what the general will claims is good for everybody. Given this, individuals cannot be given liberty to decide whether it is in their own interest to fulfill their duties to the sovereign. Well, this is important, right? Because it sounds like here there's no room for dissent, which is true, right? In Rousseau's, hypothetical society, you can't, as an individual, you cannot depart from what the general will dictates and still be a part of that political community, right? And this is where he comes up with perhaps his most second famous saying, besides, man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. Here he says that the individual citizens must be made to conform themselves to the general will. Thus, they must be forced to be free, right? So it's a very weird kind of freedom, right? And he says here, he makes a distinction between the two types of freedom. The first type of freedom, which is what we think of doing what you want to do, right? The freedom that's in the state of nature of Hobbes and Rousseau. Natural freedom, right? And he says that natural freedom, once you join into a political community, has to be replaced with another type of freedom, which is the civil freedom. And the civil freedom is essentially this being part of the general will, right? And having the protection of the common body and existing within a political community. So it's a very different kind of freedom. So this is essentially what Rousseau is saying, right? And he makes the argument that people are just as free in this society as they are before, because they're surrendering rights. They surrender their natural freedoms, let's say, to members of the political community. But the thing that keeps it at sort of an equal level is that everybody else does the same thing, right? So nobody has more than anybody else. It's sort of a state of equality, because the freedoms that you give up to the general will, everybody else within the community also gives up their freedoms to you, right? So each right that you have comes along with a corresponding duty, right? So you receive things from other people, but yet you have a duty to support those other people, right? So it's kind of a strange account. So that's essentially the account that Rousseau provides of how we get out of this mess, right? Essentially, what it comes down to is we have to submit ourselves to what the general will comes up with, right? And if we are well attuned, what we want, we are going to want what the general will wants, because the general will represents our interests, right? Supposedly as a part of a new body, right? So you even have to think about it as like a new kind of constitution, right? So we have, as individuals in the state of nature, we have our own bodies, our own persons, right? But Rousseau thinks that when we come together into a political community, we actually form a new body, right? So it's not necessarily ourselves that have the freedom, but it's the freedom of this new constituted body that Rousseau thinks replaces our individual freedom. And he thinks that because this new body is composed of all the individual members, then that still keeps some of the freedom of the individuals in place. It's kind of a confusing account, and you'll see it's reminiscent of this collective notion that you see represented in the board. Anyway, I'll get your paper questions posted this tonight or tomorrow. I'm going to get the quiz up over the next couple of days as well. If you guys have any questions about anything or you want to propose your own paper topic, feel free to shoot me an email, and I hope you have a good week.